Something terrible, something cataclysmic took place somewhere between 1660 and 1550 BCE. A volcanic island in the Mediterranean violently erupted. It was called Thera. Today we know it as Santorini. Half of the island sank into the Mediterranean, inundating an ancient Cycladic civilization. We can still visit what's left of the island today, and even tour the ancient Bronze Age ruins covered in volcanic pumice until the mid-20th century. It's the Eastern Mediterranean's version of Pompeii. Many are convinced that this was, in fact, what Plato described as Atlantis. They've pointed out that the concentric circles described by Plato resemble how Thera would have looked prior to the eruption. We're talking about an eruption 10 times the size of Krakatoa, the largest such eruption on the planet in the last 10,000 years. The tsunami created would have inundated the entire Mediterranean coast along with the land of Egypt. Might this eruption have coincided with the biblical account of the plagues upon Egypt, including the drowning of Pharaoh's charioteers? Many point out that the eruption took place well before the biblical period, which most scholars date to around 1280 BCE, the presumed date of the Exodus. Yet, volcanic pumice was discovered in the excavation of the capital of the Hyksos, called Avaris. So maybe the eruption, in fact, took place closer to 1500 BCE. Some suggest that the expulsion of the Hyksos dovetails with the account of the Exodus. The Hyksos, after all, were Asiatics who might have been related to the Hebrews. Some argue that they may, in fact, have been the Hebrews. The Bible records that a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. Might this dovetail with the account of the Egyptians expelling the Hyksos? The biblical chronology dates the Exodus to around 1480 BCE. So all of this just might fit. What's the problem with this, Watson? Well, archaeology reveals that certain ancient cities in the land of Canaan, such as Beth-El, Tel Bet Mirsin, Bet Shemesh, Eglon, and Hatzor, show signs of violent destruction between the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, roughly 1200 BCE. That might fit the invasion of the land under Joshua. Go back 40 years for the time the Israelites were wandering in the Sinai desert, and we have a date for the Exodus of around 1240 to 1280 BCE. That's more than 2 centuries after the traditional biblical date of 1480 or so. So the great majority of today's scholars who think there was an Exodus at all will date it to the 13th century, the 1200s. Elementary, don't you suppose? Perhaps the memory of the eruption at Thera influenced the narratives about the plagues, but the eruption itself, so they say, occurred long before the Exodus. Some, of course, still staunchly defend an early date for the Exodus. They just have to explain why the evidence of destruction in the land of Canaan dates 2 centuries later. What can we deduce? Some might argue that a supernatural explanation for this case is theoretically possible. Agreed. But it's a huge mistake to theorize before one has data. Inevitably, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Bear in mind, many scholars don't think there was an Exodus at all, and don't believe that Israelites ever lived in Egypt. Others argue to the contrary, that the Hebrews not only existed, but might be equated with an ancient band of brigands known as Habiru. That, of course, hardly paints a flattering picture of the Israelites. At least according to the Bible, Moses was able to unite the semi-nomadic tribes of Israel into the worship of a single God. He managed to lead them in a concerted revolt and from slavery into freedom. The Exodus was not only a liberation from servitude, it was also the crucial event in Israel's self-conception. But here, the biblical narrative departs from the tradition of writing history in antiquity. Most ancient history is dominated by self-glorification. For example, in Egyptian inscriptions, the pharaohs appear as glorious conquerors, even if they weren't. When an Egyptian monarch was defeated in a foreign land, the scribes kept silent, or else fabricated a victory. Not so in the Bible. After their departure, the Israelites are described frankly, experiencing fear, hunger, thirst, doubt, dissension. And the honor of victory belongs not to Moses, but to the divine. Many are inclined to trash the God of the Exodus as punitive and parochial, caring only about his little flock, while the Egyptians are slaughtered en masse. Is the biblical God a monster? Now there's a debatable issue. But on a philosophical level, there's a real shift in thought when it comes to monotheism. Previous religions saw human destiny as subject to the laws of nature. At Sinai, human destiny is separated from the cycle of nature. Human destiny breaks loose from the fatalistic chain of recurrence. Progress, not repetition, becomes the law of life, and humans bear responsibility for human destiny. At Sinai was born a concept as revolutionary as the wheel, the idea that the human lot can be improved. It's hard for us to grasp the revolutionary nature of this. It wasn't in the law itself. Other law codes predate it, such as Hammurabi's famous law code. But the concept of one God was actually seen as irrational in a world where civilizations were based on the pluralism of the forces of nature. לא תעשה לך פסל וכל תמונה אשר בשמיים ממעל ואשר בארץ מתחת ואשר במים מתחת לארץ ולא תשתחווה להם ולא תעבדם כי אנוכי השם אלוהיך אלקנה פוקד עוון אבות על בנים על 30 ועל רבים לשונאי ועושה חסד לאלפים לאוהבי ולשומרי מצוותיי. The Bible's ban on graven images was a direct assault on the conventions of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And the Sabbath has no ancient parallel. The idea of compassion through rest from labor. Overriding all was the idea that people can choose between good and evil. The idea had yet to be tested, And many Israelites longed to return to bondage rather than face an uncertain future. But they go forward toward Canaan and a new future. The age of patriarchal innocence ends with Israel crossing Sinai to the Promised Land. A new force had entered history. Israel had become an organic unity, a people, and in their own eyes, God's chosen people. Some ask, what, is this racism? The idea that one people is chosen above all others? But the Bible presents chosenness as a burden to bring compassion, ethics, and humanity to world civilization. Returning to history, the Bible gives the distinct impression that the Exodus was a mass movement. Barely a year after leaving Egypt, the Israelites were said to have numbered more than 600,000 men of fighting age, that is, at least 20 years old. Including women and children, they would have numbered 2 to 3 million. Modern demographers estimate Egypt's entire population back then at not more than 3 million. With such an army, what did Israel have to fear from Egyptian chariots or the Canaanites ahead of them? And yet the spies who are dispatched to scout out the land return with fear and trembling because of the giants. Why is such a mass movement never even mentioned in other ancient accounts? Some suggest that the biblical word for 1,000, elif, actually refers to a small tent group of soldiers, so that when the Bible references 600,000, it really means 600 tent groups, bringing the total number of Hebrews to only about 25,000. But could even 25,000 Israelites really have crossed the Reed Sea and spent 40 years in the Sinai desert without leaving a trace? In fact, the only extra-biblical mention of Israel is from the victory stela of Ramses II's successor, Merneptah, describing a victory over Israel. Israel lies desolate, its seed is no more. Might this be the smoking gun we need to prove the existence of the Israelites? Nevertheless, the only place positively identified of all of the wilderness journeys is Kadesh Barnea, an oasis 46 miles south of Beersheba on the border with Canaan. They camped there after receiving the Ten Commandments. Here, Moses' sister Miriam and his brother Aaron died. The spies were also dispatched from there. And this was the location of Moses' act of disobedience when he struck the rock in order to draw water, when God had told him to speak to it. For this, he was forbidden to enter the land of Canaan? The Bible recounts that from the sea crossing, they headed east along the King's Highway, an important caravan route. They continued on a very circuitous route, wanting to avoid the Egyptian strongholds that flourished in Gaza in the time of Ramses II. Possible routes of the Exodus are all over the map. And then there's that popular game, Pin the Tail on Mount Sinai. There are two different traditions in the Bible about the mode and journeys of the conquest. According to Numbers 20, verses 14 and following, the Israelites circumvented Edom because its ruler wouldn't allow them to pass through. So they penetrated a weak point in Transjordan, the Amorite kingdom of Heshbon and its king Sihon. From then on, Israel enlarged its holdings east of the Jordan as far as Bashan. But another tradition, in Numbers 33, records the Israelites marching right through Edom and Moab and on to Jericho. There's no mention of the kingdoms of Transjordan or bypassing Edom. Maybe there were 2 penetrations into Canaan, an early one along the plateau of Transjordan to Jericho when the area was still desolate at the end of the 14th century BCE, and a second that couldn't follow the same route because new kingdoms had blocked the way. So in the 13th century BCE, they bypassed Edom and Moab and forced their way through the Amorite kingdom to the north. But in all of their wanderings, a new generation came forth, and the successors of the wilderness generation received a new identity. From this point on, the Bible describes Israel as a nation apart, with little reference to other cultures. For better or for worse, the idea of chosenness, which have led some, like the lead character Tevye in the famous Broadway production Fiddler on the Roof, to ask, couldn't you have chosen somebody else? So let it be written, so let it be done.